Good morning, students. This is your first lecture on genetics. We're going to be looking at genetic traits, specifically um, the early principles of genetics, sex traits, what we refer to as Mendelian genetics. So, when we talk about genetics, we're really talking about what we call patterns of inheritance, and there's two types of inheritance. There's Mendelian genetics, or Mendelian inheritance, and non-Mendelian inheritance. Okay, Mendelian inheritance, this is essentially where we refer to the complete dominance of one trait over another trait. Okay, which means that uh, um, in that type of inheritance, the traits follow what is referred to as Mendel's principles of heredity. Mendel, real quick, is the scientist, Austrian scientist, who came up with the concept of genetics. He used pea plants, which you can see represented here in this diagram to our left. And what he wanted to know was why did he have some peas that were yellow, some peas that were green? And so he took pea plants that had yellow or green peas and he crossed them and calculated the probability um, of what he saw. Now, the other type of inheritance, which is what your second lecture for this week is going to cover, is called non-Mendelian inheritance, and that refers to traits that can share dominance or be linked to a second trait such as gender, or rely on multiple genes or multiple forms of genes, referred to as an allele, that can be inherited. And as a result, with non-Mendelian genetics, they do not follow Mendel's principles of heredity. Okay? So real quick, let's connect meiosis, which you've already learned, protein synthesis, which you've already learned, and genetics. Okay. So I want you guys to think for a minute with these two questions. I want you to be able to explain how the maternal, which is your mother, and paternal, which is the father, DNA combine to create the physical trait of an offspring. And I also want you to think during this lecture, this question, after producing multiple offspring, how would you compare the physical features? Okay, keep those two questions in mind. All right, so genetics and dominance. Well, genetics is the science that studies the specifics of heredity. Like, how do we get genes from a parent to an offspring? Okay, you, as a human, you inherit two copies of your genes, one from your mom and one from your dad. Okay, this includes your physical or physiological characteristics that we refer to as traits. So, height, blood type, even aspects of your personality. Okay. Because there are two copies of every gene in a chromosome, we often call them homologous pairs. Okay, homologous meaning that they're the same, and because there's two of them, a pair. Okay, homologous pairs. All right. In genetics, when we talk about the physical characteristics, we usually use the term phenotype. Phenotype. Okay. So anytime that you hear the word phenotype, you know that we're talking about the physical characteristic, the thing that we can see, right? For example, we can see a person who is tall versus a person who is short. When you get tested for your blood type, we can see whether you have blood type A, blood type O, blood type B, blood type AB, um, things like that. So things that we can actually physically see, those are your phenotypes, okay? Now, when we talk about the genetic combinations of a trait that leads to that physical characteristic, leads to the phenotype, we refer to that as the genotype. Geno for genetics. Okay, so the genotype is your genetic combination. Your phenotype, your physical characteristic, um, is determined by the genetic combination or that genotype. Okay, now different versions of the same trait or those genes we refer to as alleles. Alleles. All right. So when I say an allele, we're talking about the specific gene that codes the proteins that give you that trait. Okay. In other words, folks, your traits. your hair color, the way your hair looks, your eye color, your skin color, even the way your skin reacts to the environment, whether it's wet outside or dry, hot or cold, you know, all of these are coded by protein. So literally, your entire body, save for your skeletal structure, is made up of expressed proteins, modified proteins, but expressed proteins. Okay. Um, in Mendelian genetics, we often say that a trait is either dominant or recessive. Okay, and we symbolize this by using a capital letter for dominant and a lowercase letter for recessive. Okay, and dominant traits are usually those that are expressed, so that in other words that they're seen, and recessive are typically not expressed, meaning that they're hidden. But this isn't always the case. All right, and this is where genotypes come in. So combination of alleles. We have three possible combinations. Okay, we've got what is referred to as homozygous dominant, which means that both pairs of alleles are dominant and they're identical. Okay, which means you got two capital letters. Heterozygous dominant is when one allele is dominant and the other is recessive, so you have one capital letter, one lowercase letter. And a homozygous recessive is when both alleles are recessive, or, in other words, two lowercase letters with your genotype. Okay, this is referred to as the principle of dominance. Okay, so certain traits can only be expressed if they're either homozygous dominant or heterozygous dominant. Okay, um, now with homozygous recessive, they are still expressed, but it requires both alleles to be recessive in order for that trait to be expressed. If you're heterozygous dominant, the dominant trait gets expressed. If you're homozygous dominant, well, obviously the trait's going to be expressed because you have both dominant traits. Okay. Now, these three combinations can also follow two other principles. Um, the second principle is the principle of segregation. So there are some alleles that are not passed from parent to offspring as a pair, which means that the offspring can only inherit one set of alleles from each parent. Okay, this is because now remember, this is because in meiosis only one pair of homologous chromosomes is passed on to a sperm or an egg. Okay, remember, folks, I want you to recall from last quarter when we talked about meiosis that meiosis does 2 rounds of cell division. Okay, without the process of DNA synthesis in between telophase 1 and prophase 2. Okay, again, it's because we're trying to reduce the number of chromosomes present. Remember, humans have 46 chromosomes. You get 23 from mom, 23 from dad. All right, so those sperm and egg have to have 23 chromosomes each in order for you to have the full 46. Okay, so this is referred to as the principle of segregation. All right, you don't get a pair of chromosomes from mom and a pair from dad, you get one from each. So basically that's what segregation in this case means. All right, now the principle of independent assortment. All right, this refers to the step of meiosis or mitosis called metaphase, right? In meiosis, remember, in metaphase 1 and metaphase 2, the chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell, right? Um, as a result, they don't line up in the same order every single time. It's completely random, okay? Um, as a result, you might get one gene from your mom and one gene from your dad yourself, but your brother or your sister may have gotten a completely different version of the same gene from your mom and from your dad. Okay, so that adds what we call genetic variation. Okay, um, that's why it's rare for people who are related to each other to look identical because of this independent assortment. All right. Now, the way Mendel calculated probability for his patterns of inheritance, he used what is called a Punnett square. Okay, this is what this diagram is, folks. It is a Punnett square. Okay, it is the one way to predict the inheritance of traits by offspring. Okay, so the traits of the parents are written on the outside, like you see here, and only written along the top and the left. We never use the right or the bottom. Okay, these are left blank. All right, and using this, we can determine the 4 possible, let me emphasize the word possible, genotypes of offspring that these parents could have. Okay. So in this example here, we were comparing, say, red flowers and white flowers. Okay. So a parent that has a red flower is red is the dominant trait, so it is represented by the capital R. White is a recessive trait, so we represent it with a lowercase r. Okay. And in this example, we have, as you can see, 2 heterozygous parents. Okay, they're both red, but they both carry the allele for a white flower. Okay, so then we cross them. We write 2 capital R's in here. We write a capital R and a lowercase r in here. We write a capital R and a lowercase r in here. And in here, we get 2 little r's. Okay. What this means, folks, is that if these 2 flowers were to be crossbred, right, there is a 1 in 4 or 25% chance that they would have an offspring that is pure red, meaning with homozygous dominant. There is a 2 in 4 or 1/2 or 50% chance that these 2 parents would produce an offspring that is also heterozygous dominant for red. And then there's a 1 in 4 or 25% chance that these 2 parents would have an offspring with white flowers. Okay, so probability, which is something that you learned, I believe, in Math 1, okay, or Math 2. And so when you add up the numbers, okay, you have a 75% chance, or 3/4, or 3 out of 4 probability that the flowers would be red, and a 1 in 4 chance, or 25% likelihood that you would get a white flower. Okay, so what I want you to do, somewhere in your handbook, in the appropriate section, I want you to take this combination here. This uppercase B, lowercase b would represent a blue flower, and this should be 2 lowercase b's representing a white flower. Okay. What I want you to do is I want you to take the parent combinations here, and I want you to draw a Punnett square in your handbook, putting 1 parent across the top, 1 parent along the left, remembering that the white flower should be 2 lowercase b's. This is incorrect. It should be 2 lowercase b's. And then I want you to cross them, and I want you to calculate the probability of blue flowers to white flowers in that Punnett square practice. All right. Now, there are other types of patterns of inheritance, like I said, that are non-Mendelian, and you'll learn about those later this week when you watch the Amoeba Sisters video on non-Mendelian genetics. But there is one type of inheritance that follows more in line with Mendelian genetics, and that's referred to as sex-linked traits. Sex-linked means that these are traits that are determined by a pair of chromosomes called the sex chromosomes. Okay. In humans, we have a pair of chromosomes, the X and the Y. Okay. If a human embryo inherits 2 X chromosomes, meaning 1 X from the mom and 1 X from the dad, that makes that individual female. while getting an X chromosome from mom and a Y chromosome from dad um, generates an individual as a male. Okay, so I want to make this clear, folks. Everybody gets their X chromosome, their first X chromosome from mom. Okay, that there is no getting a Y chromosome from mom, anything like that. Every single human on Earth gets their X chromosome from their mom. Okay, it is the second sex chromosome, the one that we get from dad, that determines our gender. So, in other words, your dad determined whether you'd be um, a boy or a girl. Okay, because we get the either the X chromosome or the Y chromosome from dad. All right. Now, when we talk about sex-linked traits, we typically refer to the X chromosome only. Okay. Sorry, guys. The Y chromosome really just is there to um, determine your sexual characteristics. So, like, it's essentially where testosterone comes from, determines your anatomical makeup, things like that. But aside from that, the Y chromosome does absolutely nothing. Okay. In fact, gentlemen, your Y chromosome is a mutated version of an X chromosome. Yep, that's right. You're mutated women. Deal with it. Um, but anyway, when we talk about sex-linked traits, again, we're talking about traits that are located on the X chromosome. So this means that ladies, when we talk about sex-linked traits, we're talking about a full pair or homologous pair or a heterozygous pair for you because you've got one allele on the one on each chromosome. While gentlemen, you only have one copy because you've only got the one X chromosome. Okay. So an example of a sex-linked trait is color blindness. Okay. Um, Color blindness is a recessive sex-linked trait. Um, if you are colorblind, it means that you uh, got the traits from your parents. So, gentlemen, usually it's the males that are at a higher risk for getting color blindness because if you are colorblind, it is because you've got um, the trait from mom. And you don't have, and because you don't have a second X chromosome, you don't have any way to um, cover up or hide that recessive trait. Okay. Um, Ladies, it is very rare for a woman to be born colorblind. It is possible though, but in order for that to happen, basically the female would have to inherit both recessive traits um, from both parents. All right. Um, so if you look at the image to the left here, if you can see the number that's in there, then you do not have color blindness. If you cannot or you have difficulty seeing it, it means that you're either a carrier or that you are red-green colorblind. Okay. So if we look at the Punnett square over here to the right, you see that we have parents with a father who is colorblind because you see that lowercase b right here indicating that he has a trait. Well, his mother here is heterozygous dominant, which means she's got one trait that doesn't have color blindness and one trait that does. So she is referred to as a carrier. All right, so if we put these guys into a Punnett square, now you'll notice there's an X and a Y here, right? These refer to the sex chromosomes. They're always, when it comes to determining a sex-linked trait using a Punnett square, we always use the sex chromosome as the base, okay, while the trait is superscripted itself, okay? And you'll see this when you look at your multiple alleles lecture tomorrow from the Amoeba Sisters. They do the same thing with multiple allele traits. Anyway, so we place our mother across the top here, and we've got our father down the left. And when we cross them, we can see that they've got one, two, three children who will not suffer, three possibilities of giving birth to a child that doesn't have color blindness. And then we've got one child combination that will have color blindness. Okay. Now, what I want you to also notice is that they have a 100% chance that that if they have a girl, the girl will not have color blindness. 100% chance that the girl will not have color blindness. On the other hand, if they have a boy, there's a 50% chance that he will develop color blindness. Okay. So ultimately, the two adults will have a 25% chance of having a child who will be colorblind. Okay. That pretty much covers Mendelian genetics. If you guys have any questions, obviously you know that you can text me, email me, leave a question in the Canvas chat. I will try and make sure to check that a little bit more often. But with that, this concludes our lecture on Mendelian genetics. Y'all take care.